Formscape, a YouTube channel that focuses more on the philosophy and the sciences. I just met the guy personally, very lovely fellow, este, and recently discovered his channel, purely by accident actually. Este, I want to understand his philosophy, what he is, whether or not I agree with him or not. If you're already familiar with my position, the answer will be obvious that we're in completely opposing oppositions when it comes to metaphysics and ontology, right? Judged by his videos, especially his Formscape manifesto, which explains his metaphysics and ontology, and the videos he did after that are basically educational videos about the philosophy of mysticism, esotericism, and occultism, right? And great videos, great editing. Not gonna complain too much over there. I just want to understand his philosophy and what my views on it. His philosophy are very syncretic and borrows many elements from many areas, mainly in the broad sense idealism, metaphysical idealism. From Fichte to Hegel to with the German idealism for the most part, like that I noticed, and for the most part like that. But his biggest influence are Neoplatonism, or at least he's borrowed heavy elements from it when it comes to his terminology, and mainly of them all, Carl Jung. He is heavily a Jungian idealist, especially when it comes to the archetypes like the collective unconscious and synchronicity. And he believed in various things, although I do see as problematic and like certain like ethnocentric views of spirituality. Although to my knowledge, he is not a racist at all. He clarified that. It's just the way he talks about it gives that vibe. Even though I may be misinterpreting it, that's you know maybe he didn't use the right words when he was talking about it. But regardless, and also if he believed that UFOs are real, the phenomena as demons, like literal demons. That I don't believe there's such a thing as a demon, let alone anything supernatural, paranormal, in general. Judging by the literature of the more recent, you know, I'm trying to be the most up to date possible in the academic, peer review, technical, scholarly monograph literature about the UFO phenomenon, and most part all the empirical evidence that shows that 99% to 95% of all cases of UFOs, either what seeing a UFO, close contact, abduction, etc., are all fake horses. That there are more mundane explanation, psychological, you know, misremembering, illusion, delusions, if they're hoaxes, or more mundane phenomena like certain animals they misreport and stuff like that. Is that 1 to 5% that hasn't been explained, we're agnostic to the issue, but there's no evidence whatsoever of the extraterrestrial hypothesis, or the multidimensional hypothesis, or the terrestrial hypothesis, or anything that is considered on the brown sense paranormal, supernatural, uh, the preternatural, super mundane, you know, whatever term you want to use, right? There's no evidence for such thing at all. The closest we could get, the best evidence of a case for a UFO at all, that is the wow signal. It's the only one that meets all the requirements that NASA SETI has, which yes, they have their own standard, what will be considered first contact. The wow signal is the only one that fits the description, and even after all that, now there's been more natural explanations of cosmic weather phenomenon. But before we have to get to him, I need to understand Carl Jung first, right? Because he's clearly been heavily influenced by Carl Jung. He used many of his metaphysical ontology and his foundation. What do we know about Carl Jung? Well, philosophically speaking, he is an idealist, right? He developed the influential concepts of synchronicity, collective unconsciousness, and the John Pauli conjecture of quantum mechanics. Este, Bajaj, all the evidence has been developed since during his lifetime and after his lifetime. Uh, it's been rejected by the majority of academic philosophers and scientists. So if you want to study Carl Jung and his philosophy, you're not gonna find in the philosophy department or any science department, only in the humanities like literature, for example, or or their, if the culture studies and stuff like that. So actual science and philosophers, they don't reject it because his definition of synchronicity and collective judgment has been vague and contradictory and lacks any empirical evidence and has become in many cases unfalsifiable. And Carl Jung, during his lifetime, had developed this pseudo cult, pseudo religious movement, becoming like a secular prophet throughout his time. And sadly, right, it was a his attention, but it was a part of his time that he was heavily influenced by the folkish mysticism that I was already raised it and developed many ideas about the unconscious. This is where he first developed around this time. They will focus about blood and soil, and there is Aryan unconscious like spirituality versus non-Aryan, especially Jewish, and give it this racist mentality of time that actually influenced many high official Nazi officers in the government. Este, hell, even in India, he gave this racist Orientalist view about the rich in spirituality mixed with irrationalism. And his infamous essay about the Wotan, that Hitler was possessed by a Wotan, but the Odin, sorry. And John has explained, which influenced Nazi ideology, like indirectly, that certain races had innate characteristics related to the unconscious and archetypes. And given his involvement with the folkish movement and identifying himself with the mysticism, esoteric, and occult movements around this time period, and consider psychoanalysis or analysis in general as a form of religion, este, and given his pragmatic views of innate characteristic of certain races with the unconscious, which influenced Nazi ideology in many ways. And in fact, in the early times, he did support the National Socialist movement at the beginning. A great chapter analyzed by Robert Noll who goes into detail about this. I gotta read it in full, so this may take a while, but it's important to know that what's going on at the time during the late 30s. In the second of the chapter called For a Short Time, he believed in the possibilities of Nazism. Perhaps the most painful issue confronting both Jungians and non-Jungians alike is John's alleged involvement with National Socialism. Jimmy Nemetche, to his credit, especially asked almost all of his interviews who knew John in the 1930s and 40s about his attitude towards the Jews and National Socialism and his possible involvement with the Nazis. The vast majority of his discipline absolved him of this. Others equivocate. The truth is no doubt somewhere between. John Volker's worldview and his love of pagan symbolism and myth made the National Socialist movement in Germany attractive to him at first. The National Socialist constructive ideology are the elements of German folkish thought that have been popular for several generations among the educated middle classes. They borrow their solar symbolism from occultism and Aryan mysticism. The National Socialist flag contains a white solar disk or mandala at its center, which is set another solar symbol, the Hakekrets or swastika, a symbol of eternal recurrence and regenerated power. The sun was a potent natural symbol, and National Socialist rhetoric was often laced with reference to the link of power of the sun to the Volk. Runic symbols were also borrowed by National Socialists to signify various political and military organizations. John was always interested in the spiritual regeneration of the Aryan race. He sought ways to reach the archaic man or German barbarian within the members of his tribe. Like Houston Stewart Chamberlain, he considered the English to be racially closest to the Germans, Swiss, and Austrians. John had little interest in politics per se. He may have been a Volkish German and perhaps anti-Semitic, but there's no evidence that he was ever a Nazi. There was not to say that he opposed the Nazis either. Wilhelm Bitter, the founder of the Stuttgart Institute of Psychotherapy, who was an analyst with John in the 1930s, captured the paradoxical attitude and behavior of John during the Nazi period. And I quote, "It's so easy for the Freudians and not only the Jewish to say John was a Nazi and anti-Semite." End quote. Bitter said to Namchenkin in September 1970 that this statement is wrong, but for a short time he believed in the possibility of Nazism and favored it. He spoke of the Jewish psychology, but not in the anti-Semitic sense. He passed pupil or Jewish Eric Newman, Carl Other, and Jacob Bovey of all Jewish pupils. Either Peter had indicated that in 1933 and 1934 there was growing sympathy for the Nazis in Jung's circle. Intrigued, Newman pushed further, and I quote, "You did say here that John and some of his pupils became Nazis in 1934. Will you say that so strongly? 1933? Yes. That he became a Nazi? Young? Not a Nazi in the strict sense." As Peter took pains to point out, John was interested primarily in the spiritual revitalization of the German people. He thought of rebirth as the rebirth in the good sense, said Peter. Like Peter, many others were of the opinion that John's fatal flaw was that he tended to psychologize everything and discard the dangers of the political development in Germany. After almost 20 years of being relatively ignored by the German media, suddenly in 1933, 1934, and 1935, John enjoyed popularity north of the Swiss border that was unprecedented. He was courted by German scholars as never before. He gave seminars in Berlin and lectured in other German cities. According to Jolande Jacobi, one of his closest disciples from the 30s onwards, his ideas about the Nazi movement was that of chaos gives birth to the good or to something valuable. So in the German movement, he saw a chaotic, we could say, precondition of the birth of the new world. In response to the letter to him, expressing her after her concerns about the dangers of Nazism, Jacobi said, "He answered me this: keep your eyes open. You can't reject the evil because the evil is brighter of light. Lucifer means light brain." He was convinced of this. You see, the shows that he didn't see, he didn't understand the other world. For him, this, the Nazi movement, was an inner happening which happened to accept as a psychological precondition for rebirth. In the spring of 1936, John's famous essay on Wotan appeared. As John often claimed later in life, it was indeed the first time he expressed concern about the excess of the Germans. However, at the same time, John confirmed his belief that Germany was possessed by Wotan and the true God of the German people. And the only problem was that far too many of them were unconscious of this fact. This unconsciousness of the reemergence of this pagan god in the 20th century led to their possession, he said. If only they would become conscious of their god, then the Germans will find their way to a true spiritual rebirth. Again, John simply psychologized the political problem. On the issue of anti-Semitism, Jacobi herself presented conflict opinions. On the one hand, she defended John against such charges, citing her long friendship with him and the innocence of his folkish ideas about the differences between the civilized Jew and the barbarian Germans. You know your ancestors, you already doctors and rabbis and scientist persons 6,000 years ago, and my ancestors were running around naked with the skins of animals 1,000 years ago in the German woods. He once told her. On the other hand, Jacobi admitted that his opinions were sometimes crude, but he also said, "One day, I would never like to have children from a person who has Jewish blood." In the early years of the Nazi era, Jung at times expressed himself in the way that they were consistent with anti-Semitic rhetoric, particularly when in the presence of non-Jewish people. On his way to meet John for the first time in 1933, Michael Forman found himself in a third-class compartment with a Jewish man who told him he was leaving Germany because of the National Socialists. And I quote, "When I arrived in Zurich the next day and I met Jung, I remarked about the Jews and the courage of coming to Germany. To my astonishment, this started June off and went on and on and on. I was used to people talking like this for personal reasons, so I just listened. He talked about the Jews at top speed for, I should think, 3/4 of an hour. What he said was extensive, but two points stood out in my memory. One was that he made a very strong point that Jews were different from other people, and they ought to be dressed up different clothes because otherwise we mistook them for people like ourselves. I suppose he told me about their customs in the way he might usually do on other occasions. I think his difference of the Jew from other was the main point he made. The second one was he asked me rhetorically what I thought the Jews were doing in a desert for 40 years eating sand. Of course they were, he said, feeding other people's crops until they move on. One disciple reports similar attitude of John during the early 1930s, but Cornelia Bruno remembered John being terribly upset the day that the synagogue burned in Germany. Prior to that time, according to her, Jung was always working on this fact. Why are we so different? What is different between Aryans and Jews? In a way, she confessed, uh, we also were frightened of the Jews because they were so clever. They were more clever than we are, and so they could take over. We felt the difference. They are Mediterranean people with much longer history and a much more developed intellect. We just think in another way. I have a lot of Jewish friends, by the way, very nice one. That is, to be honest, that statement sounds like the current example of like, I'm not racist. I have a black friend. I vote Obama. Este, Irene Chamberlain alleged in her December 1969 interview with Jeanine Lamette that John actually encouraged anti-Semitic attitudes in his patients as a form of psychotherapeutic technique, a way of always being conscious of their shadow. And I quote, well, he was very strong about the Jews. It was a great problem, a great collective problem. They could all make the Jews our shadows because we were jealous of them and their position. We also point out they were such opportunists that you really had to be quiet, clear, but you were being exploited if you felt your worth and stand firm. Else, you will be caught in a program. So he used encourage negative attitudes towards the Jews. If you see what I mean, and so far we will say, well, you see what you feel about the Jews who use you. End quote. Chamberlain, who then practiced in London, recounted the problem that the British Jungian had in maintaining the British flavor of their organization when so many Jews flooded England in the 1930s. She discussed the tension with Jung, and I quote, he said, if you have any feeling against Jewish people, and of course we all had at this particular moment with them all swamping us and using us, be clear, keep up, don't let it go down, because if you don't do, you'll be caught in a program. Well, this is a difficult thing. This is something that I think leak out as a negative attitude to the Jews. Yet another helped the Jewish analysis more than Peter Bain and John. So I am quite sure he wasn't anti-Semitic in the sense of the word that some Jews were made out. But I think he felt that we must keep our shadow up, which was so easy to happen in any country where the Jews take possessions like they did in Germany, like they did to a certain extent in certain circles in England. End quote. During the 1930s, many of the swift German members of the psychological club in Zurich were, like Jung, sympathetic to what's happening north of the border. In the club were some real Nazis. Remember, Ali Balanki, the first wife of Vladimir Rosenbaum, was one of Jung's disciples from the late 1910s until the 1930s, when the psychological club threw Rosenbaum out. Another patient shown, who was also in Zurich in the late 1930s, Mary Elliott, also remembers similar club atmosphere. And I quote, I think that I think that in the beginning of the war, quite a lot of club people were pro-German. She does add, however, they were just uncomfortably pro-German. They were not even pro-Nazis, but they were very Germanic in this part of Switzerland. Whether one regards John as anti-Semitic, a Nazi sympathizer, or any combination thereof, the roots of the attitude expressed during the Nazi era can be found in his folkish utopianism and Aryan mysticism, which predates the rise of Adolf Hitler and the National Socialists as they in Germany. We must remember that those folkish ideas had a vibrant cultural life of their own, often even independent of politics, in the years before First World War. To be fair, John and those who lived in German Europe at the time during the century, we must remain sensitive to the specific cognitive category at those times. It was an era in which biology and spirituality were fused into a ponte amalgam, and which the idea of an alien Christ appeared viable, indeed preferable to many. It was the only natural that should look to for his closest representative on Earth, which was Jan. Given that his ideas influenced Nazi ideology between 1933 to 1945, it was the most controversial period where we analyze his ideas. When he was the leadership role of the International General Medicine for Society for Psychotherapy, or renamed the International Society for Psychotherapy under Nazi oversight. Between 33 to 39, after Freud left Vienna and the psychoanalysis was under Nazi suspicion as Jewish science, German psychologists reorganized the profession using aligned with Aryan policies, and Jung became a professor of this, at the Psychology Psychotherapy Association in 1933, and they placed him above the German branch, led by Medias Goring, a cousin of Hermann Goring, who maintained close contacts with. Este, and this role gained prominence for the first time in his life, and especially his analysis and the spiritual side. This is where he moved away from more traditional science and focused more on alchemy and analysis of religion and symbolism. And this is where we see many of the infamous writings about the Aryan versus Jewish psychology and this essentially pseudoscientific thinking, which actually undermines his previous views of universalism, where there's a universalist being like a collective nature and became more of a like a us and them mentality. He was also the editor of the Central Blood, where he mentioned there are two kinds of psychology, Jewish and Aryan. The former being intellectual, rationalistic, while the other being more intuitive and symbolic. And again, this goes back to the more racist mentality at the time. Este, and Picasso distinguishes psychological types earlier in his career about his language about races, people, and collective psyches, and he took more of an ethnic approach. The scholar, the psychoanalytical scholar Mcgowan, sees this as a sign poetic of Jung's ethnocentric universalism, where the collective unconscious subtle center into European mix and exclude others. In fact, his analysis of religions are actually very contradictory and non-scientific at all. In fact, his analysis of Hinduism is very Orientalist in nature. When he's talking about Hinduism, he says what he's actually talking about is Shaivism exclusively, and all types of different types of Hinduism that actually goes against his overall message of synchronicity, collective unconscious. His overall view of religion actually goes against it if we focus other types of Hinduism. And we see that again with his connection with the esoteric core movements in Germany at the time. And again, we can also go back to his controversial wartime essay, where he described the Nazi phenomenon as the return of the god of Odin, a manifestation of the collective unconscious of the German people. And you can see this as a moral invasion. We're trying to psychologicalize everything by mythologize the movement instead of confronting it. And it can also be viewed as a self-image, as a prophet during his time when he went to his psychological the club, where he made this pseudo-cult, pseudo-religious movement, becoming this secular pseudo-prophet figure. And his contacts with Mcgowan and other German psychotherapists under Russian rule until 1938, where he tried to move away from Nazi movement, where it becomes more evident who they actually are. He tried to internationalize psychotherapy beyond Nazi control, but after the the event of the Scripture, he changed his tone, moving away from Nazism because of the increase of violence. And instead of being this prophet-like figure, he became more like a wise old man, like a wise sage, trying to distance himself to his connection under Nazi rule. Well, he wasn't a Nazi by any stretch, but he held many sympathies that influenced the Nazis. This is where around the same time, especially from 1938 onwards, that he focused more on symbolism, mythology, and alchemy. This is where most of his famous ideas start, as basically as an unconscious way move away from his connection to the Aryan movement. And he interpreted the world as an archetypical struggle between consciousness and the shadow, good versus evil within a collective psyche. Again, this universalized evil and removal of responsibility, turning genocide into a metaphor. Este, and which is again very problematic in many ways. Even after the war, he led International Society of Psychoanalysis while it served Nazi interests in many cases because he never moved away from this type of mentality. He even defended himself, argued that he stayed involved to protect psychoanalysis from Nazi corruption and keep communication open with German colleagues. Although there is evidence that he saved certain Jews, but again, the records are very mixed. Again, his connection with the German doesn't help either. And in fact, he had connections and ties with the infamous Nazi occultist Miguel Serrano, who actually forward one of his forward one of their works. I repeat, Carl Jung, even after World War II, had befriended an infamous Nazi occultist Miguel Serrano, by far the most controversial and debatably the most influential occultist in all of Latin America. Going back to his ideas of synchronicity and collective consciousness, is the problem with like synchronicity is what is the reason for accepting synchronicity as explanation for anything in the real world? What it what it explains is more simply and elegantly explaining by the ability of the human mind to find meaning and significance where there is none. If you think the all pairs of things that it can happen in a person's lifetime and add to our very versatile ability to find meaningful connections between things, and then seems likely that most of us will experience many meaningful coincidences. But the coincidences are predictable, but we are the ones who get the meaning. If there were synchronicity between the mind and the world, such certain coincidence resonate with some beyond the next physical spatial temporal world, there will still be a problem figuring out those truths. What guide could one possibly use to determine the correctness of the interpretation? There is none. In fact, like synchronicity is just a classic example of apophenia, a phenomenon of spontaneous perception, connection, and meaningfulness in unrelated phenomena, which, as Dr. Martina Belmers has stated, is there's currently a controversial debate concerning whether unusual experiences are symptoms of mental disorders. If mental disorders are consequences of such experience, or if people with mental disorders are especially susceptible to or even looking for these experiences. Again, very problematic what you ask me. And what about the collective consciousness? He believed that Lycote archetypes universal mental predisposition now grounded in experiences, like Plato's theory of forms. Archetypes do not originate in the world on the senses, but exist independently of the world and not directly by the mind. Jung believed that the archetypes arise spontaneously in the mind, especially in times of crisis. Just there are meaningful coincidences which opened the door to esoteric truth. So to crisis open the door of collective unconscious, lets out a archetypical to reveal some deep truth hidden from ordinary consciousness. In mythology, Carl Jung claims basic stories of the archetypes is a reservoir of deep, hidden, wondrous truths. And the same thing goes with dreams, psychological crisis, and other forms of meaningful coincidences, all gateway to the collective conscious, which is ready to restore the individual psyche to health with his insight. Jung maintained that these metaphysical notions are scientifically grounded, yet there is no empirical testable in any meaningful way. In short, they're not scientific at all. In fact, any book about one-on-one introduction about consciousness and stuff like that will point out that the majority of philosophers scientists has rejected altogether. For example, este, because it's often used of anecdote, myth, and dream material without sufficient critical or comparative methodology. John tends to generalize from limited cultural personal evidence. Theories of some sort has supported universal claim, like archetypes, rest on empirical grounds. And many of his ideas emerge from primarily Indo-European mythologies and Western cultures. Este, and it doesn't attend to non-Western culture or less well-known tradition, leading to a kind of cultural bias. There's also they are not sufficiently defined or vague, as Gordon Mcgowan has noted. They are very vague and contradictory when he's trying to define archetype, collection of conscious, synchronicity, etc., and in problematic ways. The collective unconscious in particular is criticized for being untestable and unfalsifiable. Este, and his notion is criticized of synchronicity as substitute subjective meaning for scientific proof. Often, he often treats personal intuition or symbolic interpretation as though it has some kind of empirical or logical weight that scientists claim require. And again, this goes back to the innate essential racial characteristics, which again echoes fascist ideology, even though pretty much that wasn't his intention, but there you go. And his attitude towards women as well, based on outdated gender biases. And again, people who still believe in it and who Formscape also believe it's the term unconscious, even though no modern day psychologists, neuroscientists, or psychiatrists, even modern day psychoanalysts don't believe in unconscious the way Freud and Jung has described. The definition has changed significantly. If the psychoanalysis nowadays and modern day psychology is neuroscience don't use the word unconscious the same way as Freudian or Jungian approach, right? For example, cognitive psychologists, when they say unconscious, they're referring to brain processes which happen without our conscious thought, like pumping, you know, like blood circulation, that happens unconsciously. Or social psychologists refer to split decision making, you know, and not the way John and Freud would view, where there's an eternal, fully unconscious personalities. That's just no, that's been proven false over and over again. As Anthony Floor has pointed out, who his analysis of Carl Jung, and I quote, he was an impressive figure, even at old age. But those who find themselves frustrated confusing John's right should turn to the verbatim report of his seminar, which revealed him as an accomplished off-the-cuff speaker. But his charisma was based upon his certainty that he was right, but was reinforced by his verbal fluency and by his ability to quote support from instruction from innumerable obscure sources. Este, and his contribution to psychology and psychotherapy have been underestimated because of the revelatory, unprovable basis upon which they rest, and the general perception that he is a difficult writer preoccupied with esoteric subjects. Although conventionally minded skeptics are likely to regard some of Yu's belief as eccentric, there is no reason for dismiss everything with people. Yeah, for example, his conception of the psyche and self-regulatory system can be illuminating. His typology of the introvert extrovert has been adopted by experimental psychologists. But because of his own experiments, he drew attention to the phenomenon which was not received of the investigation it deserves. The need which those who had lost their faith feel for something to replace it, and dangers which threaten us all and the whole population worships dictators, like Mao Zedong or Adolf Hitler, and go beyond the skies. Experimental psychologists, for the most part, do not feel the need to believe in anything other than science, but experimental psychologists are only a tiny fraction of mankind. Carl Jung was a guru who saw the light, who generalized from his own experience, who abandoned scientific tradition in which he had been trained, and to whom he was and to whom knew that he was right. Despite this, he made valuable contributions to psychology and our perception of human nature. But it has to be acknowledged that that some of his beliefs were border on delusions, but his period of mental illness opened doors of perception were close to normal people, as compared to which beliefs of Rudolf Steiner, for example. The views of the universe purported by Jung seemed only mildly eccentric, yet he shared with them a conviction that he was right, that he knew which distinct evidence, which is based on subjective revelation, following breakdown rather than upon observation and proof. So this is the man who influenced Formscape the most. Very pragmatic, pretty much believe his own delusions. His ideas would be disproved on multiple occasions. And his ideas, by accident, influenced Nazi ideology. I think the first statement that he said about in his manifesto that he treats the scientists as like an elite clergy of professionals. This is not true. Science is one of the very few places left in the world that is a truly democratic process, that's a corrective process. To say that goes against the attitude of science as adventurers, or goes against the status quo in education, especially in the DIY scene. And apparently, if my understanding is correct, what he's trying, he kind of rejects evolution of the brain about consciousness. And also he claims about the scientific method and how we do everything. They're saying we no longer pretty much do empirical evidence, which is not true at all. Like, as the founder of pragmatism, John Sanders Peirce has prioritized and laid the foundation for what we have to do about the reasoning, a posteriori reasoning, and empiricism, because it's full of inference. And for example, Wilfred Sellar complex pragmatic naturalism approach to inquiry, when experience provides raw material for knowledge, but not informed concepts that are non-sensory. Our contact with the external world is through experience, and use language so we can explicitly name and classify in the empirical object language statements we take to be true, And talking about abstract entities like Platonic gods had no explanatory power because scientists don't just do naive falsification. It's a falsifiability with the scientific method mixed with the null hypothesis, falsifiability, and statistical method and Bayesianism, right? And pragmatism, because they combine scientific method with these things, but not what he thinks is just almost like logical politics a little bit. That because mixed with Bayesianism and statistical method, we're allowed for the fact that modern science theories typically make claims far beyond what can be directly observed, but enables us to how this non-empirical evidence fits in, or can be fitted. Like Wilfred Sellar has pointed out, in dimension describing and explaining the world, science is the measure of all things, for what is that it is, and for what that is not it is. Because the best way we know how to make objective knowledge, or at least try as possible to make objective knowledge about the reality, in science and philosophy, is to make the least amount of assumptions with the simplest and minimum requirements, which is with the highest predictive value and explanatory power. The scientific method, or the best way to settle differences of opinion, with the scientific method mixed with the statistical method, falsifiability, the null hypothesis, Bayesianism, with his fallibilism can eliminate beliefs with no practical work, and the method will result in views that are objective and impersonal. Ordinary language, for example, will solve philosophical problems. In this approach to metaphysics, the philosopher confused language, give false metaphysical statements, and create many pseudo problems, which these problems are made up create more confusion. Este, and we are using language for responding sensory experience and empiricism. We correspond truth statements, where language are hardly formalized, where axioms are determined by definition. This is why the majority of philosophical schools of thought, you know, go to this approach. And those they don't, or don't work at all, or they are self-serving. Because, you know, actions have consequences. Consequences are objective, and we use language to describe objective reality and label the fact that corresponds with reality, and these decisions will manifest themselves in forms of control and political experiences, and reject philosophy that use language that reject this pragmatic approach will always fail no matter how many arguments or premises or logical deduction, and your argumentation will save you from a person, for example, trying to shoot you. Este, if we see you, for example, the scientific model of people's behavior and languages, which empiricism like science is self-correcting. A hypothesis must conform expectations set by background knowledge, which rely on the fewest assumption and include fewer new assumptions. It must make evident which observation statements imply, more probable than any other. It must not contradict any evidence-less contradiction, more less than any completed theory, and must explain more of the evidence than any other hypothesis. The natural pattern of matter, energy, and space-time, according to the laws of physics, is absolute. This is why any philosophy that rejects science, at least how we understand it, relies by thinking really hard, a priori, and thought the armchair almost exclusively without evidence or observation. Knowledge always derives from experience, and reject all logical or mathematical proof which require to be empirical observation and testing in laboratories. And he also said in the beginning of his manifesto that scientific breakthroughs are come to an end, and now it's based off enforced beliefs, based on prestige of dead people, and he shows a picture of Einstein, ignoring the fact that we have disproven Einstein that the universe is non-local thanks to Bell's theorem and Bell's inequality. So that's one thing. So that is an obvious mistake. There is a reason why many philosophers believe, for example, este, that the universe is not local thanks to quantum mechanics, because everything is inherently quantum mechanical. And in fact, quantum mechanics has no distinction between the very big and the very small. They actually cross each other. Again, this proves another view that the first generation of early 20th century physicists believed to. Again, this proving his very statement. With this layout of what is how will we perform knowledge, how we do empirical evidence, answer basically, I think it's supposed to answer all of his questions, right? But again, he is a Jungian, and I already mentioned Carl Jung's philosophy is inherently false in many ways, been disproven many occasions. So I don't know that that will ever convince him. I mean, he believes that UFOs are literal demons. And he makes false statements about science, especially saying they abandon ontology. No, we do manifest ontology all the time. But it's like he just stuck in this outdated logical positive view of science. That science was away from that since the 1960s. We always do science. We acknowledge that it's science, right? Sean Carroll has stated as such, right? And everything we know exists in the physical. Anything beyond the physical spatial temporal world does exist, and we are confident that it does, given that its illogical contradiction nature and how unstable it actually is. There's a reason why the majority of philosophers and scientists are ontological naturalists and empiricists, right? And atheists. There's a reasons for this. There's a lot of literature, and the concept like the whole proper consciousness is a super problem because based on the language, for example, if the like I said, as Massimo, the philosopher of science, Massimo Pollini has pointed out that there is no real distinction between the hard problem and the easy proper consciousness, and the illusion that there is one is caused by the pseudo profanity that often accompanies by category mistakes. It is the easy problem that is hard, while the hard problem just seems hard because of engaged ill-defined intuitions. We can solve this, the hard problem. In fact, we know it's under reductive physicalism. All the evidence point in psychology, neuroscience, and other fields in the science of studying consciousness and personal identity. Now with AI, who are already possess some form of consciousness, enforce a reductive physicalist view. In fact, a functionalist computationalist view that Hilary Putnam has defended when he was still alive. Like he defended a core a liberal functionalism, and he was a well-known defender of scientific realism. Like I said, all the evidence points to the opposite that he portrays, and the way how I lay out the scientific method, how we do evidence, pretty much answer his question how we do these things. We never abandon ontology. We just use different languages now. And most of the problems are not problems anymore. I will put like literature in the description to see what we're going at. But yeah, thank everybody watch this video. Let's subscribe, share. I know I was just ranting. I'm very bored, and I'll see you guys next time.